We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson for Pascal Covici. My name is Mary Katherine Blackwood. I'm 18 years old and I live with my sister Constance. I have often thought that with any luck at all, I could have been born a werewolf because the two middle fingers on both my hands are the same length. But I've had to be content with what I had. I dislike washing myself and dogs and noise. I like my sister Constance and Richard Plantagenet and Amanita phalloides, the death cup mushroom. Everyone else in my family is dead. The last time I glanced at the library books on the kitchen shelf, they were more than 5 months overdue, and I wondered whether I would have chosen differently if I had known that these were the last books, the ones which would stand forever on our kitchen shelf. We rarely moved things. The Blackwoods were never much of a family for restlessness and stirring. We dealt with the small surface transient objects, the books, and the flowers and the spoons, but underneath, we had always a solid foundation of stable possessions. We always put things back where they belonged. We dusted and swept under tables and chairs and beds and pictures and rugs and lamps, but we left them where they were. The tortoiseshell toilet set on our mother's dressing table was never off place by so much as a fraction of an inch. Blackwoods had always lived in our house and kept their things in order. As soon as a new Blackwood wife moved in, a place was found for her belongings, and so our house was built up with layers of Blackwood property, weighting it and keeping it steady against the world. It was on a Friday in late April that I brought the library books into our house. Fridays and Tuesdays were terrible days because I had to go into the village. Someone had to go to the library and the grocery. Constance never went past her own garden, and Uncle Julian could not. Therefore, it was not pride that took me into the village twice a week, or even stubbornness, but only the simple need for books and food. It may have been pride that brought me into Stella's for a cup of coffee before I started home. I told myself it was pride and would not avoid going to Stella's no matter how much I wanted to be at home. But I knew, too, that Stella would see me pass if I did not go in, and perhaps think I was afraid. And that thought I could not endure. "Good morning, Mary Katherine," Stella always said, reaching over to wipe the counter with a damp rag. "How are you today?" "Very well, thank you." "And Constance Blackwood, is she well?" "Very well, thank you." "And how is he?" "As well as can be expected. Black coffee, please." If anyone else came in and sat down at the counter, I would leave my coffee without seeming hurried and leave, nodding goodbye to Stella. "Keep well," she always said automatically as I went out. I chose the library books with care. There were books in our house, of course. Our father's study had books covering 2 walls, but I liked fairy tales and books of history, and Constance liked books about food. Although Uncle Julian never took up a book, he liked to see Constance reading in the evenings while he worked at his papers, and sometimes he turned his head to look at her and nod. "What are you reading, my dear?" "A pretty sight, a lady with a book." "I'm reading something called The Art of Cooking, Uncle Julian." "Admirable." We never sat quietly for long, of course, with Uncle Julian in the room, but I do not recall that Constance and I ever opened the library books, which are still on our kitchen shelf. It was a fine April morning when I came out of the library. The sun was shining, and the false, glorious promises of spring were everywhere, showing oddly through the village grime. I remember that I stood on the library steps, holding my books and looking for a minute at the soft-tinted green in the branches against the sky, and wishing, as I always did, that I could walk home across the sky instead of through the village. From the library steps, I could cross the street directly and walk on the other side along to the grocery, but that meant that I must pass the general store and the men sitting in front. In this village, the men stayed young and did the gossiping, and the women aged with gray, evil weariness and stood silently waiting for the men to get up and go home. I could leave the library and walk up the street on this side until I was opposite the grocery and then cross. That was preferable, although it took me past the post office and the Rochester house with the piles of rusted tin and the broken automobiles and the empty gas tins and the old mattresses and plumbing fixtures and wash tubs that the Harler family brought home. And I genuinely believe loved. The Rochester house was the loveliest in town and had once had a walnut-paneled library and a second-floor ballroom and a profusion of roses along the veranda. Our mother had been born there, and by rights it should have belonged to Constance. I decided, as I always did, that it would be safer to go past the post office and the Rochester house, although I disliked seeing the house where our mother was born. This side of the street was generally deserted in the morning, since it was shady, and after I went into the grocery, I would in any case have to pass the general store to get home, and passing it going and coming was more than I could bear. Outside the village, on Hill Road and River Road and Old Mountain, people like the Clarkses and the Carringtons had built new, lovely homes. They had to come through the village to get to the Hill Road and River Road because the main street of the village was also the main highway across the state, but the Clark children and the Carrington boys went to private schools, and the food in the Hill Road kitchens came from the towns and the city. Mail was taken from the village post office by car along the River Road and up to Old Mountain, but the mountain people mailed their letters in the towns, and the River Road people had their hair cut in the city. I was always puzzled that the people of the village, living in their dirty little houses on the main highway or out on Creek Road, smiled and nodded and waved when the Clarkses and the Carringtons drove by. If Helen Clark came into Albert's grocery to pick up a can of tomato sauce or a pound of coffee her cook had forgotten, everyone told her good morning and said the weather was better today. The Clarks' house is newer, but no finer than the Blackwood house. Our father brought home the first piano ever seen in the village. The Carringtons owned the paper mill, but the Blackwoods own all the land between the highway and the river. The shepherds of Old Mountain gave the village its town hall, which is white and peaked and set in a green lawn with a cannon in front. There was some talk once of putting in zoning laws in the village and tearing down the shacks on Creek Road and building up the whole village to match the town hall, but no one ever lifted a finger. Maybe they thought the Blackwoods might take to attending town meetings if they did. The villagers get their hunting and fishing licenses in the town hall, and once a year, the Clarkses and the Carringtons and the Shepherds attend town meeting and solemnly vote to get the Harler junkyard off Main Street and take away the benches in front of the general store, and each year the villagers gleefully outvote them. Past the town hall, bearing to the left, is Blackwood Road, which is the way home. Blackwood Road goes in a great circle around the Blackwood land, and along every inch of Blackwood Road is a wire fence built by our father. Not far past the town hall is the big black rock which marks the entrance to the path, where I unlock the gate and lock it behind me and go through the woods and am home. The people of the village have always hated us. I played a game when I did the shopping. I thought about the children's games where the board is marked into little spaces and each player moves according to a throw of the dice. There were always dangers like lose one turn and go back 4 spaces and return to start, and little helps like advance 3 spaces and take an extra turn. The library was my start, and the black rock was my goal. I had to move down one side of Main Street, cross, and then move up the other side until I reached the Black Rock. When I would win. I began well with a good safe turn along the empty side of Main Street, and perhaps this would turn out to be one of the very good days. It was like that sometimes, but not often on spring mornings. If it was a very good day, I would later make an offering of jewelry out of gratitude. I walked quickly when I started, taking a deep breath to go on with and not looking around. I had the library books and my shopping bag to carry, and I watched my feet moving one after the other. 2 feet in our mother's old brown shoes. I felt someone watching me from inside the post office. We did not accept mail, and we did not have a telephone. Both had become unbearable 6 years before, but I could bear a quick stare from the office. That was old Miss Dutton, who never did her staring out in the open like other folks, but only looked out between the blinds or from behind curtains. I never looked at the Rochester house. I could not bear to think of our mother being born there. I wondered sometimes if the Harler people knew that they lived in a house which should have belonged to Constance. There was always so much noise of crashing tinware in their yard that they could not hear me walking. Perhaps the Harlers thought that the unending noise drove away demons, or perhaps they were musical and found it agreeable. Perhaps the Harlers lived inside the way they did outside, sitting in old bathtubs and eating their dinner off broken plates set on the skeleton of an old Ford car, rattling cans as they ate and talking in bellows. A spray of dirt always lay across the sidewalk where the Harlers lived. Crossing the street, lose one turn, came next, to get to the grocery directly opposite. I always hesitated, vulnerable and exposed, on the side of the road while the traffic went by. Most Main Street traffic was going through, cars and trucks passing through the village because the highway did, so the drivers hardly glanced at me. I could tell a local car by the quick, ugly glance from the driver, and I wondered always what would happen if I stepped down from the curb onto the road. Would there be a quick, almost unintended swerve toward me? Just to scare me, perhaps, just to see me jump? And then the laughter coming from all sides, from behind the blinds in the post office, from the men in the front of the general store, from the women peering out of the grocery doorway, all of them watching and gloating to see Mary Katherine Blackwood scurrying out of the way of a car. I sometimes lost 2 or even 3 turns because I waited so carefully for the road to clear in both directions before I crossed. In the middle of the street, I came out of the shade and into the bright, misleading sunshine of April. By July, the surface of the road would be soft in the heat and my feet would stick, making the crossing more perilous. Mary Katherine Blackwood, her foot caught in the tar, cringing as a car bore down on her. Go back, all the way back, and start over. And the buildings would be uglier. All of the village was of a piece, a time, and a style. It was as though the people needed the ugliness of the village and fed on it. The houses and the stores seemed to have been set up in contemptuous haste to provide shelter for the drab and the unpleasant. And the Rochester house, and the Blackwood house, and even the town hall had been brought here perhaps accidentally from some far, lovely country where people lived with grace. Perhaps the fine houses had been captured, perhaps as punishment for the Rochesters and the Blackwoods and their secret bad hearts, and were held prisoner in the village. Perhaps their slow rot was a sign of the ugliness of the villagers. The row of stores along Main Street was unchangingly gray. The people who owned the stores lived above them, in a row of second-story apartments, and the curtains in the regular line of second-story windows were pale and without life. Whatever planned to be colorful lost its heart quickly in the village. The blight on the village never came from the Blackwoods. The villagers belonged here, and the village was the only proper place for them. I always thought about rot when I came toward the row of stores. I thought about burning, black, painful rot that ate away from inside, hurting dreadfully. I wished it on the village. I had a shopping list for the grocery. Constance made it out for me every Tuesday and Friday before I left home. The people of the village disliked the fact that we always had plenty of money to pay for whatever we wanted. We had taken our money out of the bank, of course, and I knew they talked about the money hidden in our house as though it were great heaps of golden coins, and Constance and Uncle Julian and I sat in the evenings, our library books forgotten, and played with it, running our hands through it and counting and stacking and tumbling it, jeering and mocking behind locked doors. I imagined that there were plenty of rotting hearts in the village, coveting our heaps of golden coins, but they were cowards, and they were afraid of Blackwoods. When I took my grocery list out of my shopping bag, I took out the purse too, so that Albert in the grocery would know that I had brought money, and he could not refuse to sell to me. It never mattered who was in the grocery. I was always served at once. Mr. Albert or his pale, greedy wife always came right away from wherever they were in the store to get me what I wanted. Sometimes, if their older boy was helping out in school vacation, they hurried to make sure that he was not the one who waited on me. And once, when a little girl, a child strange to the village of course, came close to me in the grocery, Mrs. Albert pulled her back so roughly that she screamed, and then there was a long, still minute while everyone waited before Mrs. Albert took a breath and said, anything else? And I always stood perfectly straight and stiff when the children came close, because I was afraid of them. I was afraid that they might touch me, and the mothers would come at me like a flock of taloned hawks. That was always the picture I had in my mind, birds descending, striking, gashing with razor claws. Today, I had a great many things to buy for Constance, and it was a relief to see that there were no children in the store, and not many women. Take an extra turn, I thought, and said to Mr. Albert, "Good morning." He nodded to me. He could not go entirely without greeting me, and yet the women in the store were watching. I turned my back to them, but I could feel them standing behind me, holding a can or a half-filled bag of cookies or a head of lettuce, not willing to move until I had gone out through the door again, and the wave of talk began, and they were swept back into their own lives. Mrs. Donnell was back there somewhere. I had seen her as I came in, and I wondered, as I had before, if she came on purpose when she knew I was coming, because she always tried to say something. She was one of the few who spoke. "A roasting chicken," I said to Mr. Albert, and across the store his greedy wife opened the refrigerated case and took out a chicken and began to wrap it. "A small leg of lamb," I said. "My Uncle Julian always fancies a roasted lamb in the first spring days." I should not have said it, I knew, and a little gasp went around the store like a scream. I could make them run like rabbits, I thought, if I said to them what I really wanted to, but they would only gather again outside and watch for me there. "Onions," I said politely to Mr. Albert. "Coffee, bread, flour, walnuts," I said, "and sugar. We are very low on sugar." Somewhere behind me, there was a little horrified laugh, and Mr. Albert glanced past me briefly, and then to the items he was arranging on the counter. In a minute, Mrs. Albert would bring my chicken and my meat wrapped, and set them down by the other things. I did not turn around until I was ready to go. "2 quarts of milk," I said, "a half pint of cream, a pound of butter." The Harrises had stopped delivering dairy goods to us 6 years ago, and I brought milk and butter home from the grocery now. and a dozen eggs. Constance had forgotten to put eggs on the list, but there had only been 2 at home. A box of peanut brittle, I said. Uncle Julian would clatter and crunch over his papers tonight and go to bed sticky. The Blackwoods always did set a fine table. That was Mrs. Donnell, speaking clearly from somewhere behind me, and someone giggled and someone else said, "Shh." I never turned. It was enough to feel them all there, in back of me, without looking into their flat, gray faces with the hating eyes. I wish you were all dead, I thought, and longed to say it out loud. Constance said, never let them see that you care, and if you pay any attention, they'll only get worse. And probably it was true, but I wish they were dead. I would have liked to come into the grocery some morning and see them all, even the Alberts and the children, lying there, crying with the pain and dying. I would then help myself to groceries, I thought, stepping over their bodies, taking whatever I fancied from the shelves, and go home, with perhaps a kick for Mrs. Donnell while she lay there. I was never sorry when I had thoughts like this. I only wished they would come true. It's wrong to hate them, Constance said. It only weakens you. But I hated them anyway, and wondered why it had been worthwhile creating them in the first place. Mr. Albert put all my groceries together on the counter and waited, looking past me into the distance. "That's all I want today," I told him. And, without looking at me, he wrote the prices on a slip and added, then passed the slip to me so that I could make sure he had not cheated me. I always made a point of checking his figures carefully, although he never made a mistake. There were not many things I could do to get back at them, but I did what I could. The groceries filled my shopping bag and another bag besides, but there was no way of getting them home except by carrying them. No one would ever offer to help me, of course, even if I would let them. Lose 2 turns. With my library books and my groceries going slowly, I had to walk down the street, past the general store, and into Stella's. I stopped in the doorway of the grocery, feeling around inside myself for some thought to make me safe. Behind me, the little stirrings and coughings began. They were getting ready to talk again, and across the width of the store, the Alberts were probably rolling their eyes at each other in relief. I froze my face hard. Today I was going to think about taking our lunch out into the garden, and while I kept my eyes open just enough to see where I was walking, our mother's brown shoes going up and down, in my mind I was setting the table with a green cloth and bringing out yellow dishes and strawberries in a white bowl. Yellow dishes, I thought, feeling the eyes of the men looking at me as I went by. And Uncle Julian shall have a nice soft egg with toast broken into it. And I will remember to ask Constance to put a shawl across his shoulders, because it is still very early spring. Without looking, I could see the grinning and the gesturing. I wished they were all dead, and I was walking on their bodies. They rarely spoke directly to me, but only to each other. "That's one of the Blackwood girls," I heard one of them saying in a high, mocking voice. "One of the Blackwood girls from Blackwood Farm. Too bad about the Blackwoods," someone else said, just loud enough. "Too bad about those poor girls." "Nice farm out there," they said. "Nice land to farm. Man could get rich farming the Blackwood land. If he had 1,000,000 years and 3 heads and didn't care what grew, a man could get rich. Keep their land pretty well locked up, the Blackwoods do. Man could get rich. Too bad about the Blackwood girls. Never can tell what they'll grow on Blackwood land." I am walking on their bodies, I thought. We're having lunch in the garden, and Uncle Julian is wearing his shawl. I always held my groceries carefully along here, because one terrible morning I had dropped the shopping bag, and the eggs broke and the milk spilled, and I gathered up what I could while they shouted, telling myself that whatever I did, I would not run away, shoveling cans and boxes and spilled sugar wildly back into the shopping bag, telling myself not to run away. In front of Stella's, there was a crack in the sidewalk that looked like a finger pointing. The crack had always been there. Other landmarks, like the handprint Johnny Harris made in the concrete foundation of the town hall, and the Mueller's boys' initials on the library porch, had been put in times that I remembered. I was in the 3rd grade at school when the town hall was built, but the crack in the sidewalk in front of Stella's had always been there, just as Stella's had always been there. I remember roller skating across the crack and being careful not to step on it, or it would break our mother's back, and riding a bicycle past here with my hair flying behind. The villagers had not openly disliked us then, although our father said that they were trash. Our mother told me once that the crack was here when she was a girl, in the Rochester house. So it must have been here when she married our father and went to live on Blackwood Farm. And I suppose the crack was there, like a finger pointing, from the time when the village was first put together, out of old gray wood, and the ugly people with their evil faces were brought here from some impossible place and set down in the houses to live. Stella bought the coffee urn and put in the marble counter with the insurance money when her husband died. But otherwise, there'd been no change in Stella since I could remember. Constance and I had come in here to spend pennies after school, and every afternoon we picked up the newspaper to take home for our father to read, in the evening. We no longer bought newspapers, but Stella still sold them, along with magazines and penny candy and gray postcards of the town hall. "Good morning, Mary Katherine," Stella said when I sat down at the counter and put my groceries on the floor. I sometimes thought, when I wished all the village people dead, that I might spare Stella because she was the closest to kind that any of them could be, and the only one who managed to keep hold of any color at all. She was round and pink, and when she put on a bright print dress, it stayed looking bright for a little while before it merged into the dirty gray of the rest. "How are you today?" she asked. "Very well, thank you." "And Constance Blackwood, is she well?" "Very well, thank you." "And how is he?" "As well as can be expected. Black coffee, please." I really preferred sugar and cream in my coffee because it is such bitter stuff, but since I only came here out of pride, I needed to accept only the barest minimum for token. If anyone came into Stella's while I was there, I got up and left quietly, but some days I had bad luck. This morning, she had only set my coffee down on the counter when there was a shadow against the doorway. And Stella looked up and said, "Good morning, Jim." She went down to the other end of the counter and waited, expecting him to sit there so I could leave without being noticed. But it was Jim Donnell, and I knew at once that today I had bad luck. Some of the people in the village had real faces that I knew and could hate individually. Jim Donnell and his wife were among these, because they were deliberate instead of just hating dully and from habit like the others. Most people would have stayed down at the end of the counter where Stella waited, but Jim Donnell came right to the end where I was sitting and took the stool next to me, as close to me as he could come, because I knew he wanted this morning to be bad luck for me. "They tell me," he said, swinging to sit sideways on his stool and looking at me directly, "they tell me that you're moving away." I wish she would not sit so close to me. Stella came toward us on the inside of the counter, and I wished she would ask him to move so I could get up and leave without having to struggle around him. "They tell me you're moving away," he said solemnly. "No," I said, because he was waiting. "Funny," he said, looking from me to Stella and then back. "I could have sworn somebody told me you'd be going soon." "No," I said. "Coffee, Jim?" Stella asked. Who do you think would have started a story like that, Stella? Who do you think would want to tell me they're moving away when they're not doing any such thing?" Stella shook her head at him, but she was trying not to smile. I saw that my hands were tearing at the paper napkin in my lap, ripping off a little corner, and I forced my hands to be still and made a rule for myself. Whenever I saw a tiny scrap of paper, I was to remember to be kinder to Uncle Julian. "Can't ever tell how gossip gets around," Jim Donnell said. Perhaps someday soon, Jim Donnell would die. Perhaps there was already a rot growing inside him that was going to kill him. "Did you ever hear anything like the gossip in this town?" he asked Stella. "Leave her alone, Jim," Stella said. Uncle Julian was an old man, and he was dying regrettably, more surely than Jim Donnell and Stella and anyone else. The poor old Uncle Julian was dying, and I made a firm rule to be kinder to him. We would have a picnic lunch on the lawn. Constance would bring his shawl and put it over his shoulders, and I would lie on the grass. "I'm not bothering anybody, Stella. I'm not bothering anybody. I'm just asking Miss Mary Katherine Blackwood here how it happens everyone in town is saying she and her big sister are going to be leaving us soon, moving away, going somewheres else to live." He stirred his coffee. From the corner of my eye, I could see the spoon going round and round and round, and I wanted to laugh. There was something so simple and silly about the spoon going around while Jim Donnell talked. I wondered if he would stop talking if I reached out and took hold of the spoon. Very likely he would, I told myself wisely. Very likely he would throw the coffee in my face. "Going somewheres else," he said sadly. "Cut it out," Stella said. I would listen more carefully when Uncle Julian told his story. I was already bringing peanut brittle. That was good. "Here I was, all upset," Jim Donnell said, "thinking the town would be losing one of its fine old families. That would be really too bad." He swung the other way around on the stool because someone else was coming through the doorway. I was looking at my hands in my lap, and of course would not turn around to see who was coming. But then Jim Donnell said, "Joe," and I knew it was Dunham, the carpenter. "Joe, you ever hear anything like this? Here, all over town, they're saying that the Blackwoods are moving away, and now Miss Mary Katherine Blackwood sits right here and speaks up and tells me they're not." There was a little silence. I knew that Dunham was scowling, looking at Jim Donnell and at Stella and at me, thinking over what he had heard, sorting out the words and deciding what each meant. "That's so?" he said at last. "Listen, you two," Stella said. But Jim Donnell went right on, talking with his back to me and his legs stretched out so I could not get past him and outside. "I was saying to people only this morning, it's too bad when the old families go, although you could rightly say a good number of the Blackwoods are gone already." He laughed and slapped the counter with his hand. "Gone already," he said again. The spoon in his hand was still, but he was talking on. "A village loses a lot of style when the fine old people go. Anyone would think," he said slowly, "that they wasn't wanted." "That's right," Dunham said, and he laughed. "The way they live up in their fine old private estate with their fences and their private path and their stylish way of living." He always went on until he was tired. When Jim Donnell thought of something to say, he said it as often and in as many ways as possible, perhaps because he had very few ideas and had to wring each one dry. Besides, each time he repeated himself, he thought it was funnier. I knew he might go on like this until he was really sure that no one was listening anymore, and I made a rule for myself. Never think anything more than once, and I put my hands quietly in my lap. "I am living on the moon," I told myself. I have a little house all by myself on the moon. Well, Jim Donald said. He smelled, too. I can always tell people I used to know the Blackwoods. They never did anything to me that I can remember. Always perfectly polite to me. Not, he said and laughed, that I ever got invited to take my dinner with them. Nothing like that. That's enough right there, Stella said, and her voice was sharp. You go pick on someone else, Jim Donald. Was I picking on anyone? You think I want to be asked to dinner? You think I'm crazy? Me, Donham said. I can always tell people I fixed their broken step once and never got paid for it. That was true. Constance had sent me out to tell him that we wouldn't pay carpenter's prices for a raw board nailed crookedly across the step, when what he was supposed to do was build it trim and new. When I went out and told him we wouldn't pay, he grinned at me and spat and picked up his hammer and pried the board loose and threw it on the ground. Do it yourself, he said to me, and got into his truck and drove away. Never did get paid for it, he said now. That must have been an oversight, Joe. You just go right up and speak to Miss Constance Blackwood, and she'll see you get what's coming to you. Just if you get invited to dinner, Joe, you just be sure and say no thank you to Miss Blackwood. Dunham laughed. Not me, he said. I fixed their step for them and never did get paid for it. Funny, Jim Donald said. Them getting the house fixed up and all and planning to move away all the time. Mary Katherine, Stella said, coming down inside the counter to where I was sitting. You go along home. Just get up off that stool and go along home. There won't be any peace around here until you go. Now that's the truth, Jim Donald said. Stella looked at him, and he moved his legs and let me pass. You just say the word, Miss Mary Katherine, and we'll all come out and help you pack. Just say the word, Merricat. And you can tell your sister from me, Dunham started to say, but I hurried, and by the time I got outside, all I could hear was the laughter, the two of them, and Stella. I liked my house on the moon, and I put a fireplace in it and a garden outside. What would flourish growing on the moon? I must ask Constance. And I was going to have lunch outside in my garden on the moon. Things on the moon were very bright and odd colors. My little house would be blue. I watched my small brown feet go in and out and let the shopping bag swing a little by my side. I had been to Stella's, and now I needed only to pass the town hall, which would be empty except for the people who made out dog licenses and the people who counted traffic fines from the drivers who followed the highway into the village and on through, and the people who sent out notices about water and sewerage and garbage and forbade other people to burn leaves or to fish. These would all be buried somewhere deep inside the town hall, working busily together. I had nothing to fear from them, unless I fished out of season. I thought of catching scarlet fish in the rivers on the moon, and I saw that the Harris boys were in their front yard, clamoring and quarreling with half a dozen other boys. I had not been able to see them until I came past the corner by the town hall, and I could still have turned back and gone the other way, up the main highway to the creek, and then across the creek and home along the other half of the path to our house, but it was too late, and I had the groceries, and the creek was nasty to wade in our mother's brown shoes, and I thought, I am living on the moon, and I walked quickly. They saw me at once, and I thought of them rotting away and curling in pain and crying out loud. I wanted them doubled up and crying on the ground in front of me. Merricat, they called. Merricat, Merricat, and moved all together to stand in a line by the fence. I wondered if their parents taught them. Jim Donnell and Dunham and Dirty Harris leading regular drills of their children, teaching them with loving care, making sure they pitch their voices right. How else could so many children learn so thoroughly? "Merricat," said Connie, "would you like a cup of tea?" "Oh, no," said Merricat. "You'll poison me." "Merricat," said Connie, "would you like to go to sleep?" "Down in the boneyard, 10 feet deep." I was pretending I did not speak their language. On the moon, we spoke a soft liquid tongue and sang in the starlight, looking down on the dead, dried world. I was almost halfway past the fence.
"Merricat, Merricat, where's old Connie? Home cooking dinner? Would you like a cup of tea?"
It was strange to be inside myself, walking steadily and rigidly past the fence, putting my feet down strongly but without haste that they might have noticed, to be inside and know that they were looking at me. I was hiding very far inside, but I could hear them and see them still from one corner of my eye. I wish they were all lying dead on the ground.
"Down in the boneyard, 10 feet deep, Merricat."
Once, when I was going past, the Harris's boy's mother came out onto the porch, perhaps to see what they were all yelling so about. She stood there for a minute watching and listening, and I stopped and looked at her, looking into her flat, dull eyes, and knowing I must not speak to her, and knowing I would. "Can't you make them stop?" I asked her that day, wondering if there was anything in this woman I could speak to, if she had ever run joyfully over grass, or had watched flowers, or known delight or love. "Can't you make them stop?" "Kids," she said, not changing her voice or her look or her air of dull enjoyment, "don't call the lady names." "Yes, Ma," one of the boys said soberly. "Don't go near the fence, don't call no lady names." And I walked on, while they shrieked and shouted, and the woman stood on the porch and laughed.
"Merricat," said Connie, "would you like a cup of tea?" "Oh, no," said Merricat, "you'll poison me."
Their tongues will burn, I thought, as though they had eaten fire. Their throats will burn when the words come out, and in their bellies they will feel a torment hotter than 1,000 fires.
"Goodbye, Merricat,"
they called as I went by the end of the fence.
"Don't hurry back. Goodbye, Merricat. Give our love to Connie. Goodbye, Merricat."
But I was at the Black Rock, and there was the gate to our path. Chapter 2. I had to put down the shopping bag to open the lock on the gate. It was a simple padlock, and any child could have broken it, but on the gate was a sign saying private, no trespassing, and no one could go past that. Our father had put up the signs and the gates and the locks when he closed off the path. Before, everyone used the path as a shortcut from the village to the highway four corners, where the bus stopped. It saved them perhaps 1/4 of a mile to use our path and walk past our front door. Our mother disliked the sight of anyone who wanted to walk past our front door. And when our father brought her to live in the Blackwood house, one of the first things he had to do was close off the path and fence in the entire Blackwood property, from highway to the creek. There was another gate at the end of the path, although I rarely went that way. And that gate, too, had a padlock and a sign saying private, no trespassing. "The highway's built for common people," our mother said, "and my front door's private." Anyone who came to see us, properly invited, came up the main drive, which led straight from the gateposts on the highway up to our front door. When I was small, I used to lie in my bedroom at the back of the house and imagine the driveway and the path as a crossroad meeting before our front door. And up and down the driveway went the good people, the clean and rich ones dressed in satin and lace, who came rightfully to visit, and back and forth along the path, sneaking and weaving and sidestepping servilely, went the people from the village. They can't get in, I used to tell myself over and over, lying in my dark room with the trees patterned in shadow on the ceiling. They can't ever get in anymore. The path is closed forever. Sometimes I stood inside the fence, hidden by the bushes, and watched people walking on the highway to get from the village to the Four Corners. As far as I knew, no one from the village had ever tried to use the path since our father locked the gates. When I had moved the shopping bag inside, I carefully locked the gate again and tested the padlock to make sure it held. Once the padlock was securely fastened behind me, I was safe. The path was dark, because once our father had given up any idea of putting his land to profitable use, he had let the trees and bushes and small flowers grow as they chose. And except for one great meadow and the gardens, our land was heavily wooded, and no one knew its secret ways but me. When I went along the path, going easily now because I was home, I knew each step and every turn. Constance could put names to all the growing things, but I was content to know them by their way and place of growing, and their unfailing offers of refuge. The only prints on the path were my own, going in and out to the village. Past the turn, I might find a mark of Constance's foot, because she sometimes came that far to wait for me, but most of Constance's prints were in the garden and in the house. Today she had come to the end of the garden, and I saw her as soon as I came around the turn. She was standing with the house behind her in the sunlight, and I ran to meet her. "Mary Cat," she said, smiling to me. "Look how far I came today." "It's too far," I said. "First thing I know, you'll be following me into the village." "I might at that," she said. Even though I knew she was teasing me, I was chilled, but I laughed. "You wouldn't like it much," I told her. "Here, lazy, take some of these packages. Where's my cat?" "He went off chasing butterflies because you were late." "Did you remember eggs? I forgot to tell you." "Of course. Let's have our lunch on the lawn." When I was small, I thought Constance was a fairy princess. I used to try to draw her picture with long golden hair and eyes as blue as the crayon could make them, and a bright pink spot on either cheek. The pictures always surprised me because she did look like that. Even at the worst time, she was pink and white and golden, and nothing had ever seemed to dim the brightness of her. She was the most precious person in my world, always. I followed her across the soft grass, past the flowers she tended, into our house, and Jonas, my cat, came out of the flowers and followed me. Constance waited inside the tall front door while I came up the steps behind her, and then I put my packages down on the table in the hall and locked the door. We would not use it again until afternoon, because almost all of our life was lived toward the back of the house, on the lawn and the garden, where no one else ever came. We left the front of the house, turned toward the highway in the village, and went our own ways behind its stern, unwelcoming face. Although we kept the house well, the rooms we used together were the back ones, the kitchen and the back bedrooms, and the little warm room off the kitchen, where Uncle Julian lived. Outside was Constance's chestnut tree, and the wide, lovely reach of lawn, and Constance's flowers, and then, beyond, the vegetable garden Constance tended, and past that the trees, which shaded the creek. When we sat on the back lawn, no one could see us from anywhere. I remembered that I was to be kinder to Uncle Julian when I saw him sitting at his great old desk in the kitchen corner, playing with his papers. "Will you let Uncle Julian have peanut brittle?" I asked Constance. "After his lunch," Constance said. She took the groceries carefully from the bags. Food of any kind was precious to Constance, and she always touched foodstuffs with quiet respect. I was not allowed to help. I was not allowed to prepare food, nor was I allowed to gather mushrooms, although I sometimes carried vegetables in from the garden or apples from the old trees. "We'll have muffins," Constance said, almost singing, because she was sorting and putting away the food. "Uncle Julian will have an egg, done soft and buttery, and a muffin and a little pudding." "Pap," said Uncle Julian. "Merricat will have something lean and rich and salty." "Jonas will catch me a mouse," I said to my cat on my knee. "I'm always so happy when you come home from the village," Constance said. She stopped to look and smile at me. "Partly because you bring home food, of course, but partly because I miss you." "I'm always happy to get home from the village," I told her. "Was it very bad?" She touched my cheek quickly with one finger. "You don't want to know about it." "Someday I'll go." It was the second time she had spoken of going outside, and I was chilled. "Constance," Uncle Julian said. He lifted a small scrap of paper from his desk and studied it, frowning. "I do not seem to have any information on whether your father took his cigar in the garden as usual that morning." "I'm sure he did," Constance said. "That cat's been fishing in the creek," she told me. "He came in all mud." She folded the grocery bag and put it with the others in the drawer, and set the library books on the shelf. Well, they were going to stay forever. Jonas and I were expected to stay in our corner out of the way while Constance worked in the kitchen, and it was a joy to watch her, moving beautifully in the sunlight, touching food so softly. "It's Helen Clark's day," I said. "Are you frightened?" She turned to smile at me. "Not a bit," she said. "I'm getting better all the time, I think, and today I'm going to make little rum cakes. And Helen Clark will scream and gobble them." Even now, Constance and I still saw some small society, visiting acquaintances who drove up the driveway to call. Helen Clark took her tea with us on Fridays, and Mrs. Shepherd or Mrs. Rice or old Mrs. Crowley stopped by occasionally on Sunday after church to tell us we would have enjoyed the sermon. They came dutifully, although we never returned their calls, and stayed a proper few minutes and sometimes brought flowers from their gardens or books or a song that Constance might care to try over on her harp, and they spoke politely with little runs of laughter and never failed to invite us to their houses, although they knew we would never come. They were civil to Uncle Julian and patient with his talk. They offered to take us for drives in their cars. They referred to themselves as our friends. Constance and I always spoke well of them to each other, because they believed that their visits brought us pleasure. They never walked on the path. If Constance offered them a cutting from a rose bush, or invited them to see a happy new arrangement of colors, they went into the garden, but they never offered to step beyond their defined areas. They walked along the garden and got into their cars by the front door and drove away down the driveway and out through the big gates. Several times, Mr. and Mrs. Carrington had come to see how we were getting along because Mr. Carrington had been a very good friend of our father's. They never came inside or took any refreshment, but they drove to the front steps and sat in their car and talked for a few minutes. "How are you getting along?" they always asked, looking from Constance to me and back. "How are you all managing by yourselves? Is there anything you need? Anything we can do? How are you getting along?" Constance always invited them in because we had been brought up to believe that it was discourteous to keep guests talking outside. But the Carringtons never came into the house. I wonder. I said, thinking about them. Whether the Carringtons would bring me a horse if I asked them. I could ride it in the long meadow. Constance turned and looked at me for a minute, frowning a little. You will not ask them, she said at last. We do not ask from anyone, remember that. I was teasing, I said, and she smiled again. I really only want a winged horse anyway. We could fly you to the moon and back, my horse and I. I remember when you used to want a griffin, she said. Now, Miss Idleness, run out and set the table. They quarreled hatefully that night, Uncle Julian said. I won't have it, she said. I won't stand for it, John Blackwood, and we have no choice, he said. I listened at the door, of course, but I came too late to hear what they quarreled about. I suppose it was money. They didn't often quarrel, Constance said. They were almost invariably civil to each other. Niece, if that is what you mean by not quarreling, a most unsatisfactory example for the rest of us. My wife and I preferred to shout. It hardly seems like 6 years sometimes, Constance said. I took the yellow tablecloth and went outside to the lawn to start the table. Behind me I heard her saying to Uncle Julian, Sometimes I feel I would give anything to have them all back again. When I was a child, I used to believe that someday I would grow up and be tall enough to touch the tops of the windows in our mother's drawing room. They were summer windows because the house was really intended to be only a summer house, and our father had only put in a heating system because there was no other house for our family to move to in the winters. By rights, we should have had the Rochester house in the village, but that was long lost to us. The windows in the drawing room of our house reached from the floor to the ceiling, and I could never touch the top. Our mother used to tell visitors that the light blue silk drapes on the windows had been made up 14 feet long. There were 2 tall windows in the drawing room and 2 tall windows in the dining room across the hall, and from the outside they looked narrow and thin and gave the house a gaunt, high look. Inside, however, the drawing room was lovely. Our mother had brought golden-legged chairs from the Rochester house, and her harp was here, and the room shone in reflections from mirrors and sparkling glass. Constance and I only used the room when Helen Clark came for tea, but we kept it perfectly. Constance stood on a stepladder to wash the tops of the windows, and we dusted the Dresden figurines on the mantel, and with a cloth on the end of a broom, I went around the wedding cake trim at the tops of the walls, staring up into the white fruit and leaves, brushing away at cupids and ribbon knots, dizzy always from looking up and walking backward and laughing at Constance when she caught me. We polished the floors and mended tiny tears in the rose brocade on the sofas and chairs. There was a golden valance over each high window, and golden scrollwork around the fireplace, and our mother's portrait hung in the drawing room. I cannot bear to see my lovely room untidy, our mother used to say, and so Constance and I had never been allowed in here, but now we kept it shining and silky. Our mother had always served tea to her friends from a low table at one side of the fireplace, so that was where Constance always set her table. She sat on the rose sofa with our mother's portrait looking down on her, and I sat in my small chair in the corner and watched. I was allowed to carry cups and saucers and pass sandwiches and cakes, but not to pour tea. I disliked eating anything while people were looking at me, so I had my tea afterwards in the kitchen. That day, which was the last time Helen Clark ever came for tea, Constance had set the table as usual, with the lovely, thin, rose-colored cups our mother had always used, and 2 silver dishes, one with small sandwiches and one with very special rum cakes. 2 rum cakes were waiting for me in the kitchen in case Helen Clark ate all of these. Constance sat quietly on the sofa. She never fidgeted, and her hands were neatly in her lap. I waited by the window, watching for Helen Clark, who was always precisely on time. "Are you frightened?" I asked Constance once, and she said, "No, not at all." Without turning, I could hear from her voice that she was quiet. I saw the car turn into the driveway, and then saw that there were 2 people in it instead of 1. "Constance," I said, "she's brought someone else." Constance was still for a minute, and then she said quite firmly, "I think it will be all right." I turned to look at her, and she was quiet. "I'll send them away," I said. "She knows better than this." "No," Constance said. "I really think it will be all right. You watch me." "But I won't have you frightened." "Sooner or later," she said, "sooner or later, I will have to take a first step." I was chilled. "I want to send them away." "No," Constance said, "absolutely not." The car stopped in front of the house, and I went into the hall to open the front door, which I had unlocked earlier because it was not courteous to unlock the door in a guest's face. When I came onto the porch, I saw that it was not quite as bad as I had expected. It was not a stranger Helen Clark had with her, but little Mrs. Wright, who had come once before and been more frightened than anyone else. She would not be too much for Constance, but Helen Clark ought not to have brought her without telling me. "Good afternoon, Mary Katherine," Helen Clark said, coming around the car and to the steps. "Isn't this a lovely spring day? How is dear Constance? I brought Lucille." She was going to handle it brazenly, as though people brought almost strangers every day to see Constance, and I disliked having to smile at her. "You remember Lucille, right?" she asked me, and poor little Mrs. Wright said in a small voice that she had so wanted to come again. I held the front door open, and they came into the hall. They had not worn coats because it was such a fine day, but Helen Clark had the common sense to delay a minute anyway. "Tell dear Constance we've come," she said to me. I knew she was giving me time to tell Constance who was here, so I slipped into the drawing room where Constance sat quietly and said, "It's Mrs. Wright, the frightened one." Constance smiled. "Kind of a weak first step," she said. "It's going to be fine, Merricat." In the hall, Helen Clark was showing off the staircase to Mrs. Wright, telling the familiar story about the carving and the wood brought from Italy. When I came out of the drawing room, she glanced at me and then said, "This staircase is one of the wonders of the county, Mary Katherine. Shame to keep it hidden from the world. Lucille?" They moved into the drawing room. Constance was perfectly composed. She rose and smiled and said she was glad to see them. Because Helen Clark was ungraceful by nature, she managed to make the simple act of moving into a room and sitting down a complex ballet for 3 people. Before Constance had quite finished speaking, Helen Clark jostled Mrs. Wright and sent Mrs. Wright sideways like a careening croquet ball off into the far corner of the room, where she sat abruptly and clearly without intention upon a small and uncomfortable chair. Helen Clark made for the sofa where Constance sat, nearly upsetting the tea table, and although there were enough chairs in the room and another sofa, she finally sat uncomfortably close to Constance, who detested having anyone near her but me. "Now," Helen Clark said, spreading, "it's good to see you again." "So kind of you to have us," Mrs. Wright said, leaning forward. "Such a lovely staircase." "You look well, Constance. Have you been working in the garden?" I couldn't help it on a day like this, Constance laughed. She was doing very well. "It's so exciting," she said, across to Mrs. Wright. "Perhaps you're a gardener too." These first bright days are so exciting for a gardener. She was talking a little too much and a little too fast, but no one noticed it except me. "I do love a garden," Mrs. Wright said in a little burst. "I do so love a garden." "How is Julian?" Helen Clark asked before Mrs. Wright had quite finished speaking. "How is old Julian?" "Very well, thank you. He's expecting to join us for a cup of tea this afternoon." "Have you met Julian Blackwood?" Helen Clark asked Mrs. Wright, and Mrs. Wright, shaking her head, began, "I would love to meet him, of course. I've heard so much," and stopped. "He's a touch eccentric," Helen Clark said, smiling at Constance as though it had been a secret until now. I was thinking that if eccentric meant, as the dictionary said it did, deviating from regularity, it was Helen Clark, who was far more eccentric than Uncle Julian, with her awkward movements and her unexpected questions and her bringing strangers here to tea. Uncle Julian lived smoothly in a perfectly planned pattern, rounded and sleek. She ought not to call people things they're not, I thought, remembering that I was to be kinder to Uncle Julian. "Constance, you've always been one of my closest friends," she was saying now, and I wondered at her. She really could not see how Constance withdrew from such words. "I'm going to give you just a word of advice, and remember, it comes from a friend." I must have known what she was going to say, because I was chilled. All this day had been building up to what Helen Clark was going to say right now. I sat low in my chair and looked hard at Constance, wanting her to get up and run away, wanting her not to hear what was just about to be said, but Helen Clark went on. "It's spring. You're young. You're lovely. You have a right to be happy. Come back into the world." Once, even a month ago, when it was still winter, words like that would have made Constance draw back and run away. Now, I saw that she was listening and smiling, although she shook her head. "You've done penance long enough," Helen Clark said. "I would so like to give a little luncheon," Mrs. Wright began. "You've forgotten the milk. I'll get it." I stood up and spoke directly to Constance, and she looked around at me, almost surprised. "Thank you, dear," she said. I went out of the drawing room and into the hall and started toward the kitchen. This morning the kitchen had been bright and happy, and now, chilled, I saw that it was dreary. Constance had looked as though suddenly, after all this time of refusing and denying, she had come to see that it might be possible, after all, to go outside. I realized now that this was the third time in one day that the subject had been touched, and 3 times makes it real. I could not breathe. I was tied with wire, and my hair was huge and going to explode. I ran to that back door and opened it to breathe. I wanted to run. If I could have run to the end of our land and back, I would have been all right, but Constance was alone with them in the drawing room, and I had to hurry back. I had to content myself with smashing the milk pitcher which waited on the table. It had been our mother's, and I left the pieces on the floor so Constance would see them. I took down the second-best milk pitcher, which did not match the cups. I was allowed to pour milk, so I filled it and took it to the drawing room. "Do with Mary Katherine?" Constance was saying, and then she turned and smiled at me in the doorway. "Thank you, dear," she said, and glanced at the milk pitcher and me. "Thank you," she said again, and I put the pitcher down on the tray. "Not too much at first," Helen Clark said. "That would look odd, I grant you, but a call or two on old friends, perhaps a day in the city shopping. No one would recognize you in the city, you know." "A little luncheon?" Mrs. Wright said hopefully. "I'll have to think." Constance made a little laughing, bewildered gesture, and Helen Clark nodded. "You'll need some clothes," she said. I came from my place in the corner to take a cup of tea from Constance and carry it over to Mrs. Wright, whose hand trembled when she took it. "Thank you, my dear," she said. I could see the tea trembling in the cup. It was only her second visit here, after all. "Sugar?" I asked her. I couldn't help it. And besides, it was polite. Oh, no, she said. No, thank you. No sugar. I thought, looking at her, that she had dressed to come here today. Constance and I never wore black, but Mrs. Wright had perhaps thought it was appropriate, and today she wore a plain black dress with a necklace of pearls. She had worn black the other time, too, I recalled, always in good taste. I thought, except in our mother's drawing room, I went back to Constance and took up the plate of rum cakes and brought them to Mrs. Wright. That was not kind either, and she should have had the sandwiches first, but I wanted her to be unhappy, dressed in black in our mother's drawing room. My sister made these this morning, I said. Thank you, she said. Her hand hesitated over the plate, and then she took a rum cake and set it carefully on the edge of her saucer. I thought that Mrs. Wright was being almost hysterically polite, and I said, Do take two. Everything my sister cooks is delicious. No, she said. Oh, no, thank you. Helen Clark was eating sandwiches, reaching down past Constance to take one after another. She wouldn't behave like this anywhere else, I thought, only here. She never cares what Constance thinks, or I think of her manners. She only supposes we are so very glad to see her. Go away, I told her in my mind. Go away. I wondered if Helen Clark saved particular costumes for her visits to our house. This, I could imagine her saying, turning out her closet. No sense in throwing this away. I can keep it for visiting dear Constance. I began dressing Helen Clark in my mind, putting her in a bathing suit on a snowbank, setting her high in the hard branches of a tree in a dress of flimsy pink ruffles that caught and pulled and tore. She was tangled in the tree and screaming, and I almost laughed. Why not ask people here? Helen Clark was saying to Constance. A few old friends. There are many people who have wanted to keep in touch with you, Constance dear. A few old friends some evening for dinner. No, she said. Perhaps not for dinner. Perhaps not. Not at first. I myself, Mrs. Wright began again. She had set her cup of tea and the little rum cake carefully on the table next to her. Although, why not for dinner? Helen Clark said. After all, you have to take the plunge sometime. I was going to have to say something. Constance was not looking at me, but only at Helen Clark. Why not invite some good people from the village? I asked loudly. Good heavens, Mary Katherine, Helen Clark said. You really startled me. She laughed. I don't recall that the Blackwoods ever mingled socially with the villagers, she said. They hate us, I said. I don't listen to their gossip, and I hope you don't. And Mary Katherine, you know as well as I do that 9/10 of that feeling is nothing but your imagination. And if you go halfway to be friendly, there'd never be a word said against you. Good heavens! I grant you there might be a little feeling once, but on your side it's just been exaggerated out of all proportion. People will gossip, Mrs. Wright said reassuringly. I've been saying right along that I was a close friend of the Blackwoods, and not the least bit ashamed of it either. You want to come to people of your own kind, Constance. They don't talk about us. I wish they would be more amusing. I thought now that Constance was looking a little tired. If they would leave soon, I would brush Constance's hair until she fell asleep. Uncle Julian is coming, I said to Constance. I could hear the soft sound of the wheelchair in the hall, and I got up to open the door. Helen Clark said, Do you suppose that people would really be afraid to visit here? And Uncle Julian stopped in the doorway. He put on his dandyish tie for company at tea, and washed his face until it was pink. Afraid, he said, to visit here? He bowed to Mrs. Wright from his chair, and then to Helen Clark. Madam, he said, and Madam. I knew that he could not remember either of their names, or whether he had even seen them before. You look well, Julian, Helen Clark said. Afraid to visit here? I apologize for repeating your words, madam, but I am astonished. My niece, after all, was acquitted of murder. There could be no possible danger in visiting here. Now, Mrs. Wright made a little convulsive gesture toward her cup of tea and then set her hands firmly in her lap. It could be said that there is danger everywhere, Uncle Julian said. Danger of poison, certainly. My niece can tell you of the most unlikely perils. Garden plants more deadly than snakes, and simple herbs that slash like knives through the lining of your belly, madam. My niece. Such a lovely garden, Mrs. Wright said earnestly to Constance. I'm sure I don't know how you do it. Helen Clark said firmly, Now that's all been forgotten long ago, Julian. No one ever thinks about it any more. Regrettable, Uncle Julian said. A most fascinating case, one of the few genuine mysteries of our time. Of my time, particularly. My life work, he told Mrs. Wright. Julian, Helen Clark said quickly. Mrs. Wright seemed mesmerized. There is such a thing as good taste, Julian. Taste, madam? Have you ever tasted arsenic? I assure you that there is one moment of utter incredulity before the mind can accept. A moment ago, poor little Mrs. Wright would have probably bitten her tongue out before she mentioned the subject. But now, she said, hardly breathing, You mean you remember? Remember? Oh. Uncle Julian sighed, shaking his head happily. Perhaps, he said with eagerness, perhaps you are not familiar with the story. Perhaps I might. Julian, Helen Clark said, Lucille does not want to hear it. You should be ashamed to ask her. I thought that Mrs. Wright very much did want to hear it, and I looked at Constance just as she glanced at me. We were both very sober, to suit the subject, but I knew she was as full of merriment as I. It was good to hear Uncle Julian, who was so lonely most of the time. And poor Mrs. Wright, tempted at last beyond endurance, was not able to hold it back any longer. She blushed deeply and faltered. But Uncle Julian was a tempter, and Mrs. Wright's human discipline could not resist forever. It happened right in this house, she said, like a prayer. We were all silent, regarding her courteously, and she whispered, I do beg your pardon. Naturally in this house, Constance said, in the dining room. We were having dinner. A family gathering for the evening meal, Uncle Julian said, caressing his words, never supposing it was to be our last. Arsenic in the sugar, Mrs. Wright said, carried away, hopelessly lost to all decorum. I use that sugar. Uncle Julian shook his finger at her. I use that sugar myself on my blackberries. Luckily, and he smiled blandly, fate intervened, some of us that day. She led inexorably through the gates of death. Some of us, innocent and unsuspecting, took unwillingly that one last step to oblivion. Some of us took very little sugar. I never touch berries, Constance said. She looked directly at Mrs. Wright and said soberly, I rarely take sugar on anything, even now. It counted strongly against her at the trial, Uncle Julian said. That she used no sugar, I mean, but my niece has never cared for berries. Even as a child, it was her custom to refuse berries. Please, Helen Clark said loudly. It's outrageous. It really is. I can't bear to hear it talked about. Constance, Julian, what will Lucille think of you? No, really, Mrs. Wright said, lifting her hands. I won't sit here and listen to another word, Helen Clark said. Constance must start thinking about the future. This dwelling on the past is not wholesome. The poor darling has suffered enough. Well, I miss them all, of course, Constance said. Things have been much different with all of them gone, but I'm sure I don't think of myself as suffering.
In some ways, Uncle Julian sailed on. A piece of extraordinarily good fortune for me. I am the survivor of the most sensational poisoning case of the century. I have all the newspaper clippings. I knew the victims, the accused, intimately, only a relative living in the very house could know them. I have exhaustive notes on all that happened. I have never been well since.
I said I didn't want to talk about it, Helen Clark said. Uncle Julian stopped. He looked at Helen Clark, and then at Constance.
Didn't it really happen?
He asked, after a minute, fingers at his mouth. Of course it really happened. Constance smiled at him.
I have the newspaper clippings,
Uncle Julian said uncertainly.
I have my notes, he told Helen Clark. I've written everything down.
It was a terrible thing. Mrs. Wright was leaning forward earnestly, and Uncle Julian turned to her.
Dreadful, he agreed. Frightful, madam.
He maneuvered his wheelchair so his back was to Helen Clark.
Would you like to view the dining room? He asked. The fatal board. I did not give evidence at the trial, you understand. My health was not equal then or now to the rude questions of strangers.
He gave a little flick of his head in Helen Clark's direction.
I wanted badly to take the witness stand. I flatter myself that I would not have appeared to disadvantage, but of course she was acquitted after all.
Certainly she was acquitted, Helen Clark said vehemently. She reached for her huge pocketbook and took it onto her lap and felt in it for her gloves. No one ever thinks about it anymore. She caught Mrs. Wright's eye and prepared to rise. The dining room? Mrs. Wright said timidly. Just a glance.
Madam? Uncle Julian contrived to bow from his wheelchair, and Mrs. Wright hurried to reach the door and open it for him. Directly across the hall, Uncle Julian said, and she followed. I admire a decently curious woman, madam. I could see at once that you were devoured with a passion to view the scene of the tragedy. It happened in this very room, and we still have our dinner in here every night. We could hear him clearly. He was apparently moving around our dining room table while Mrs. Wright watched him from the doorway. You will perceive that our table is round. It is overlarge now for the pitiful remnant of our family, but we have been reluctant to disturb what is, after all, a monument of sorts. At one time, a picture of this room would have commanded a large price from any of the newspapers. We were a large family once, you recall. A large and happy family. We had small disagreements, of course. We were not all of us overblessed with patience. I might almost say that there were quarrels. Nothing serious. Husband and wife, brother and sister, they did not always see eye to eye.
Then why did she?
Yes, Uncle Julian said. That is perplexing, is it not? My brother, as head of the family, sat naturally at the head of the table there, with the windows at his back and the decanter before him. John Blackwood took pride in his table, his family, his position in the world.
She never even met him, Helen Clark said. She looked angrily at Constance. I remember your father well. Faces faded away out of memory, I thought. I wonder if I would recognize Mrs. Wright if I saw her in the village. I wonder if Mrs. Wright in the village would walk past me not seeing. Perhaps Mrs. Wright was so timid that she never looked up at faces at all. Her cup of tea and her little rum cake still sat on the table, untouched. And I was a good friend of your mother's, Constance. That's why I feel able to speak to you openly. For your own good. Your mother would have wanted...
My sister-in-law, who was, madam, a delicate woman. You will have noticed her portrait in the drawing-room, and the exquisite line of the jawbone under the skin. A woman born for tragedy, perhaps, although inclined to be a little silly. On her right, at this table, myself, younger then, and not an invalid. I have only been helpless since that night. Across from me, the boy Thomas. Did you know I once had a nephew, that my brother had a son? Certainly, you would have read about him. He was 10 years old and possessed many of his father's more forceful traits of character.
He used the most sugar, Mrs. Wright said.
Alas, Uncle Julian said. Then, on either side of my brother, his daughter, Constance, and my wife, Dorothy, who had done me the honor of casting in her lot with mine, although I do not think she anticipated anything so severe as arsenic on her blackberries. Another child, my niece, Mary Katherine, was not at the table.
She was in her room, Mrs. Wright said.
A great child of 12 sent to bed without her supper, but she need not concern us. I laughed, and Constance said to Helen Clark,
Mary Cat was always in disgrace. I used to go up the back stairs with a tray of dinner for her after my father had left the dining room. She was a wicked, disobedient child. And she smiled at me. An unhealthy environment, Helen Clark said. A child should be punished for wrongdoing, but she should be made to feel that she is still loved. I would never have tolerated the child's wildness, and now we really must. She began to put on her gloves again. Spring lamb roasted, with a mint jelly made from Constance's garden mint. Spring potatoes, new peas, a salad, again from Constance's garden. I remember it perfectly, madam. It is still one of my favorite meals. I have also, of course, made very thorough notes of everything about that meal, and in fact, that entire day. You will see at once how the dinner revolves around my niece. It was early summer. Her garden was doing well. The weather was lovely that year, I recall. We had not seen such another summer since, or perhaps I am only getting older. We relied upon Constance for various small delicacies which only she could provide. I am, of course, not referring to arsenic. Well, the blackberries were the important part. Mrs. Wright sounded a little hoarse.
What a mind you have, madam, so precise, so unerring. I can see that you are going to ask me why she should conceivably have used arsenic. My niece is not capable of such subtlety, and her lawyer luckily said so at the trial. Constance can put her hand upon a bewildering array of deadly substances without ever leaving home. She could feed you a sauce of poison hemlock, a member of the parsley family, which produces immediate paralysis and death when eaten. She might have made a marmalade of the lovely thorn apple or the baneberry. She might have tossed the salad with Holcus lanitus, cold velvet grass, and rich in hydrocyanic acid. I have notes on all these, madam. Deadly nightshade is a relative of the tomato. Would we, any of us, have had the prescience to decline if Constance served it to us, spiced and made into pickle? Or consider just the mushroom family. Rich as that is in tradition and deception, we were all fond of mushrooms. My niece makes a mushroom omelet you must taste to believe, madam. And the common death cup.
She should not have been doing the cooking, said Mrs. Wright, strongly.
Well, of course, there's the root of our trouble. Certainly she should not have been doing the cooking if her intention was to destroy all of us with poison. We would have been blindly unselfish to encourage her to cook under such circumstances, but she was acquitted, not only of the deed, but of the intention.
What was wrong with Mrs. Blackwood doing her own cooking?
Please. Uncle Julian's voice had a little shudder in it, and I knew the gesture he was using with it. Even though he was out of my sight, he would raise one hand, fingers spread, and he would be smiling at her over his fingers. It was a gallant Uncle Julian gesture. I had seen him use it with Constance. I personally prefer to chance the arsenic, Uncle Julian said.
We must go home, Helen Clark said. I don't know what's come over Lucille. I told her before we came not to mention this subject. I'm going to put up wild strawberries this year, Constance said to me. I noticed a considerable patch of them near the end of the garden. It's terribly tactless of her, and she's keeping me waiting.
The sugar bowl on the sideboard, the heavy silver sugar bowl. It is a family heirloom. My brother prized it highly. You will be wondering about that sugar bowl, I imagine. Is it still in use, you are wondering? Has it been cleaned? You may very well ask, was it thoroughly washed? I can reassure you at once. My niece Constance washed it before the doctor or the police had come, and you will allow that it was not a felicitous moment to wash a sugar bowl. The other dishes used at dinner were still on the table, but my niece took the sugar bowl to the kitchen, emptied it, and scrubbed it thoroughly with boiling water. It was a curious act.
There was a spider in it, Constance said to the teapot. We used a little rose-covered sugar bowl for the lump sugar for tea.
There was a spider in it, she said. That was what she told the police. That was why she washed it.
Well, Mrs. Wright said, it does seem as though she might have thought of a better reason. Even if it was a real spider, you don't wash, you just take the spider out.
What reason would you have given, madam?
Well, I've never killed anybody, so I don't know. I don't know what I'd say. The first thing that came into my head, I suppose. She must have been upset.
I assure you the pangs were fearful. You say you have never tasted arsenic? It is not agreeable. I am extremely sorry for all of them. I myself lingered on in great pain for several days. Constance would, I am sure, have demonstrated only the deepest sympathy for me, but by then, of course, she was largely unavailable. They arrested her at once.
Mrs. Wright sounded more forceful, almost unwillingly eager. I've always thought, ever since we moved up here, that it would be a wonderful chance to meet you people and really find out what happened, because, of course, there's always that one question, the one nobody has ever been able to answer. Of course, I hardly expect to talk to you about it, but look. There was the sound of a dining room chair being moved. Mrs. Wright had clearly decided to settle down. First, she said, she bought the arsenic. To kill rats, Constance said to the teapot, and then turned and smiled at me.
To kill rats, Uncle Julian said. The only other popular use for arsenic is in taxidermy, and my niece could hardly pretend a working knowledge of that subject.
She cooked the dinner. She set the table. I confess I am surprised at that woman, Helen Clark said. She seems such a quiet little body. It was Constance who saw them dying around her like flies. Oh, I do beg your pardon. I never called a doctor until it was too late. She washed the sugar bowl. There was a spider in it, Constance said. She told the police those people deserved to die.
She was excited, madam. Perhaps the remark was misconstrued. My niece is not hard-hearted. Besides, she thought at the time that I was among them, and although I deserve to die, we all do we not? I hardly think that my niece is the one to point it out.
She told the police it was all her fault. Now there, Uncle Julian said,
I think she made a mistake. It was certainly true that she thought at first that her cooking had caused all this, but in taking full blame, I think she was so very eager. I would have advised her against any such attitude had I been consulted. It smacks of self-pity.
But the unanswered question is why? Why did she do it? Unless we agree that Constance was a homicidal maniac.
You have met her, madam?
I have what? Oh, my goodness, yes, I completely forgot. I cannot seem to remember that pretty young girl is actually, your mass murderer must have reason, Mr. Blackwood, even if it was only some perverted, twisted. Oh, dear, she's such a charming girl, your niece. I cannot remember when I have taken to anyone as I have to her, but if she is a homicidal maniac...
I'm leaving.
Helen Clark stood up and slammed her pocketbook emphatically under her arm. Lucille, she said, I am leaving. We have overstayed all limits of decency. It's after 5 o'clock. Mrs. Wright scurried out of the dining room, distraught. I'm so sorry, she said. We were chatting and I lost track of time. Oh, dear. She ran to her chair to gather up her pocketbook. "You haven't even touched your tea," I said, wanting to see her blush. "Thank you," she said. She looked down at her teacup and blushed. It was delicious." Uncle Julian stopped his wheelchair in the center of the room and folded his hands happily before him. He looked at Constance and then raised his eyes to gaze on a corner of the ceiling, sober and demure. "Julian, goodbye," Helen Clark said shortly. "Constance, I'm sorry we stayed so long. It was inexcusable. Lucille!" Mrs. Wright looked like a child who knows it is going to be punished, but she had not forgotten her manners. "Thank you," she said to Constance, putting her hand out and then taking it back quickly. Again. "I had a very nice time. Goodbye," she said to Uncle Julian. They went into the hall, and I followed to lock the door after they had gone. Helen Clark started the car before poor Mrs. Wright had quite finished getting herself inside, and the last I heard of Mrs. Wright was a little shriek as the car started down the driveway. I was laughing when I came back into the drawing room. I went over and kissed Constance. "A very nice tea party," I said. "That impossible woman!" Constance put her head back against the couch and laughed. "Ill-bred, pretentious, stupid. Why she keeps coming, I'll never know. She wants to reform you." I took up Mrs. Wright's teacup and her rum cake and brought them over to the tea tray. "Poor little Mrs. Wright," I said. "You were teasing her, Merricat." "A little bit, maybe. I can't help it when people are frightened. I always want to frighten them more." "Constance?" Uncle Julian turned his wheelchair to face her. How was I?" "Superb, Uncle Julian." Constance stood up and went over to him and touched his old head lightly. "You didn't need your notes at all." "It really happened?" he asked her. "It certainly did. I'll take you to your room and you can look at your newspaper clippings." "I think not right now. It has been a superlative afternoon, but I think I am a little tired. I will rest till dinner." Constance pushed the wheelchair down the hall, and I followed with the tea tray. I was allowed to carry dirty dishes, but not to wash them. So I set the tray on the kitchen table and watched, while Constance stacked the dishes by the sink to wash later, swept up the broken milk pitcher on the floor, and took out the potatoes to start for dinner. Finally, I had to ask her. The thought had been chilling me all afternoon. "Are you going to do what she said?" I asked her. "What Helen Clark said?" She did not pretend not to understand. She stood there, looking at her hands working, and smiled a little. "I don't know," she said.